Can you hear me? Can you say something?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you now. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Everything's good?
Yeah, everything's fine. The computer just has a little bit of a lag for some reason. So I'm a bit frozen, but I was just using Zoom with my students before I hopped on. So not
Okay.
sure why it's frozen, but maybe I'll give it another minute or so. But how are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you today?
Busy day, but I'm home finally. So
I
nice,
know
nice to
I
be
I know
home.
that feeling.
Man, I was just unsure if I was gonna, I'm running around, I feel like today. I know we talked
Right.
about that earlier.
Let me remind you, we are live now. So just to
Okay,
let you know.
thank you.
So whenever you're ready, you can check your audio and stuff like that. It's 6 on the dot. So if you want to get going, we can. If you want need a minute, let me know. So you ready?
Roman, I think we might need another minute because it's still frozen, but you can hear me, right?
I can hear you and I can see you.
Am I frozen to you?
No, because I can see
Hmm.
your earring moving.
Okay. Well, I can't, um, it's frozen on my end at least. So as
Oh,
long as you can
okay.
hear me, if you want to begin, we can, or if you'd like me to, I don't know, get
Um,
back on. What do you think?
no, I can. If it gets too complicated, I'll let you know. Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right. All right. We're gonna set to begin in three, two, one. Good evening and welcome to the drive at 5 at 6 p.m. on the intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station. I'm your host, Roman, coming to you live via Zoom today. Don't forget to stay tuned to intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station for Warriors Talk with Rochelle. And she will be on as well at 6 p.m. So make sure you tune in, okay? All right. So tonight, my guest via Zoom is a contract worker at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrants and Refugee Rights. Please give a drive at 5. Welcome back to Rebecca Zalilo. Welcome back to the drive.
Hello, hello, Roman. Thank you for having me. My name is Rebecca or Rebecca Zalalo, and I was doing contract work with Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, but I am a refugee and immigration rights advocate
Okay.
and organizer as well. So thank you for having me.
Okay. Okay, no problem. I'm sorry. Got that wrong there. So please give the intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station your an update since the last time you were on the drive.
So the update that you and I were discussing was about Haiti. There's a lot of stuff going on in Haiti. As everybody was aware of on the news, we were seeing Black immigrants or Black migrants, actually, because they didn't receive refugee or asylum status yet, trying to cross the borders of the US and kind of being hackled, abused, and rounded up like herd, like some animals. And it was very painful for Black people to see. And oftentimes, at least within the Trump administration, we weren't really hearing about Black migrants coming to the US or traveling all over the world for safety reasons. You were mostly hearing it about Latin American populations. which has its pros and cons for when they discuss immigration with a Latino face, but the reality is immigration is an everybody face, and very, very heavily a Black face. And so in America, we don't often talk about that because there's so many layers of racism, abuse, torture, anti-Blackness all over the globe. So when we saw those images, we were understanding that there were some Haitians actually still stuck in Mexico. So the update that I really have is more so that Mexico has been given a lot of the US quote unquote issues, right? So immigration issues, US just pushes it onto Mexico. Mexico hasn't really been assisting or giving much humanitarian aid to Haitians. And prior to them even getting to Mexico, many Haitians were actually stuck in Chile and Brazil for years in the aftermath of a devastating 2010 earthquake, but were driven out by a pandemic-related economic downturn in the region. And in 2021, these Haitians and their Chilean-born children accounted for nearly 59,000, or about 45% of the more than 131,000 asylum applications Mexico has received, which has been a tenfold increase in the number of applicants from Haiti over the previous years. And yes,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, just wanted to say that essentially U.S. has abandoned Haitian migrants in Mexico, and the U.S. is one of the contributors to Haiti's current political and economic troubles. So what we were seeing on TV was specific to the current political issues that are happening in the country.
In essence, you're saying that the United States is passing the buck to Mexico, and Mexico is basically punting, using a football reference, punting it back to other countries to say, hey, can you deal with this matter? Am I correct on that assessment?
I would say that they're specifically pushing it to Mexico because Mexico is our neighbor. But what most people aren't aware of is that most times when migrants or anybody fleeing one country to the next, there's usually been multiple countries on that journey. So when I mentioned Chile and Brazil, those are where many Haitians were already residing after their first natural disaster. But the specific political issue that is current is a different situation altogether. So Haiti's just been going through it.
The last time we talked on the Drive at 5, there were approximately 1,500 Haitians being processed or more. In your opinion, are there any updates in regards of these Haitians being processed to enter the United States?
Mm-hmm. So President Joe Biden did already allow more than 1,000 Haitians already living in the US before 2021 to apply for something called temporary protected status, which allows them to live and work in the US on a temporary basis. This is often a status that is given to people who are quote unquote asylees, who are coming into the country. So those 15,000 people that you mentioned, I'd have to get a more accurate count. But at that time, they were supposed to have received temporary protected status. A lot of us on the ground or those working in immigration have been hearing otherwise. And we also know that for all the other immigrants, I wouldn't even say immigrants, for all the other refugees or asylees, anybody trying to come to any other country, specifically in the US, we are 3-4 years behind in this process. So it only makes sense to me that they are not being assisted automatically, and it's going to take quite some time.
What would you like to see happen to the 15,000 or so being processed?
Well, for one, it's way more than 15,000. I remember you were talking that you got that information from a certain site. It's more than that are supposed to be processed. However, if they're being processed is a different story. What I would like to see happen is we have to completely throw out the asylum process, or at least the paperwork process that we have in this country, and also with the home countries as well. The entire system is not working. It's delayed. We are years behind from people who have fled years ago, and they're still not receiving their proper documentation. So any recent crisis that we're going to have in this country or that is coming to this country, they're not getting the humanitarian aid that they need.
If possible, would you like to see Chicago to step up like they did the Afghans rather, to accept some of these Haitians entering the United States?
Mhm. Well, there's a very different reason for why that's happening. So I'm glad you asked that question. I think the first thing that viewers and everybody has to understand is that there is a difference between a refugee and asylee, those who have other statuses versus an immigrant. Okay, so we probably need to clear that up first. So a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her homeland because of war, violence, or persecution, often without warning. And they're unable to return home unless, conditions in their native lands are safe. And then usually the United Nations determines whether a person is seeking international protection meets the definition of a refugee. So it's based on well-founded fear. And then those people get a certain type of protections under international law. And life-saving support from a whole bunch of agencies, including the International Rescue Committee, and they have the opportunity to become lawful citizens, permanent residents, and eventually citizens in whatever country they receive that status, okay? An asylum seeker is basically the same person, right? But they did not receive that particular status that would give them protections. So an asylum seeker is someone who is also seeking international protection from dangers in his or her homeland, but whose claim for refugee status hasn't been determined legally. So they have to apply for protection in the country of destination, so wherever they land, to apply. And so they have to be able to prove to authorities that they meet the criteria to be covered by refugee protections, and not every asylum seeker will be recognized as a refugee. And mind you, these are people who may not speak English or the native language of the country they found themselves in. People are smuggled. There's a lot of trauma. There's just a lot that goes on there. And then it doesn't really matter how you enter the country. So if you're in the US or you arrive at a port of entry, you can seek asylum, and there's no ask for a visa or any type of authorization in advance. You just have to show up. So those are the main two statuses, but there's also SIV, which often come to those who have assisted the US government in some capacity. So particularly the Afghanis who are arriving by the thousands in the US have that particular status. So anybody who's helped the US government, if you look in our historical past, you'll see often our Middle Eastern countries because of all the war that the US has started or put their hand in. So Iraqis, Iran/Persians, different countries, but they're mostly Middle Eastern. So that is actually why we have an influx of Afghani people arriving here, because of this quote unquote debt that they have quote unquote paid to assist the US government, army, military, etc. That is why the US is responding the way they are responding. And that includes the family members or immediate family members that were able to get some sort of paperwork in order to come with that family member who assisted the government. And that is for their own safety. That is why the Taliban has been responding the way they're responding, because people will be killed right on the spot if the Taliban finds out that you have worked for the US. So I hope that answers your question. That's why the Afghanis' response is the way it is. And then the last distinction I really want to make is an immigrant and migrant. So a migrant is someone who is moving from place to place, usually for economic reasons or seasonal work. We see this a lot of times with Latin American immigrants who are coming to work in a lot of the produce or farm areas. And immigrant is someone who makes a conscious decision to leave his or her homeland, move to a foreign country with the intention of settling there. And they often go through a very long vetting process to immigrate to a new country. And a lot of times, majority of the time, immigrants who choose to come are the ones that have the means to survive here, whether it's money, family support, but refugees and asylees do not. So I hope that cleared up a little bit of
it clears up it clears up somewhat. However, I specifically Haitians and the ones that allegedly being processed, which you'll come back on the show and let us know if they have been processed or not. They have to go somewhere. And we here in Chicago accepted thousands, I believe, of Afghans here in Chicago. And they are being placed in homes and they receive, I think, $45,000 each or $30,000 each. Some receive homes, apartments, and stuff like that to live in the Chicagoland area. There was a push by the Black Caucus, I would say months ago, to have those Haitian Americans to come to Chicago, because if you open them for one group, you need to open it up for another. Your thoughts on that?
So this is precisely why I mentioned those distinctions, because those distinctions matter under our law. Yes, everybody deserves to have a home, food, money, all of these things. I agree with you, but that's just not how it works in the US. That's just not how it works in most countries. You have to come through a particular status. If you receive refugee status, you get certain types of protections. If you're an asylee, you do not have protections. However, under law, at least in the US and most countries, they're supposed to hear your case. And if your case is seen as well-founded fear, then you can be processed to become a refugee. SIVs, or people who have assisted the military, the US military, receive other protections. So it's not a matter of, do I want to see Black immigrants or other immigrants receive what they deserve? We all deserve that. They all deserve that. But it's according to status. So that's what people need to understand. It doesn't make sense. It's not great, but that is how it works here. So people who are coming here and don't have a status are considered asylees. So all these Haitians that are fleeing, they don't have any kind of status yet. They're just known to be an asylee. And if the government doesn't want to hear your case, even though they're supposed to, well, they're screwed. They've traveled from one country to another. They've brought their families. They've been injured, trauma after trauma after trauma. Doesn't matter to these border control folks. And quite frankly, to our government, because if it did, we would have processed a lot of things quickly, and we would have handled things better and not push it off to Mexico.
Let's say I'm a Haitian, let's say seeking asylum. What kind of resource here in Chicago I should report to? And let's say I made it here, but what resource should I go if I'm doing it backwards?
That's really hard to say. That's really hard to say because you don't know what kind of border patrol person you're gonna get. You don't know if the border patrol people even follow the rules given by their commanders on how they're supposed to treat people. You could, one Haitian person could have a decent border patrol officer, somebody who's really listening to their case, somebody who really believes in their plight, which, to be honest, nobody is going to be walking and doing all this stuff for fun. Nobody's leaving their homeland because they want to. Nobody's leaving their family and their kids or sending their kids because they don't care about them and don't want to. It's because they think their life is going to be better. There is no answer for somebody like me who lives in the US and is a citizen, because I don't have the inner workings of those who are on the field at the border. So I think the best person to maybe share some information are those that are actually working at the border, or those who have recently crossed over. But the process is terrible and it always changes. So that's another issue. It's always changing.
Thank you for the update. Please continue to update us on intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio station. Now, on to the next topic. We had discussed on a drive at 5 from time to time regarding the disconnect between Africans and the Black community, the diaspora. What is your opinion regarding the disconnection regarding that?
This is a very big question. I'm hoping we could break it down throughout the rest of the evening, but as an African woman myself, who comes from a refugee family from Ethiopia, who works in immigration, who has worked in Inglewood and with a whole bunch of, Black Lives Matter Chicago, Black Lives Matter Milwaukee. I'm the in-between person. I'm the go-to person for both sides often. And I have been my whole life because I mostly grew up here. And so for those of us in the middle, for those of us who understand immigration, who understand that the majority of Black people, 95%, are migrants or not from the US, there's a lot of misinformation that Americans do not receive and don't understand. And so it automatically causes for conflict. Same with the opposite side, right? There's a lot of information that Black Americans are not receiving about Africans or Africa or the Caribbean or Afro-Latino Americans or those who are Black in New Zealand or, Australia. Like, there's Black people are global, and majority of Black people do not live in the US. And I think there's a lot of things that need to be debunked. And the first one is American entitlement. We have to understand that America is a first world country. And unfortunately, I don't like using these terms first world and third world, but for the sake of not having better language, there are things that come with coming from a first world country or living in a first world country and not. A lot of benefits. At the same time, growing up here, understanding African American history very well, Black folks in Inglewood could say the same thing. So the disconnect is so large because of lack of information, lack about knowing of each other, not knowing each other's histories. And I also believe that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not African American, but I think that all of the other Black nations have a cultural identity or a strong cultural identity. And I think African Americans, I believe there's a cultural identity, but I don't think everybody's on the same page in the US, or at least of this particular ethnic group. So there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot to unpack here. Anti-Blackness within,
Well, let me.
Black America. That's another thing too. So it's a lot.
Well, what do you think a possible solution could be to have an olive branch from a disconnection to a connection between Africans and Blacks?
I have a lot of ideas, but I will start with the first one that I see happening in the US is like a 23andMe test or some sort of like identity back to African roots. I've seen a lot of, things like that to be very healing for the African American community, to be able to identify like, this is where my people are from. I belong here, because African Americans they are in the Black diaspora. And I think it's about time people start recognizing that and saying that very loudly and proudly. But for some reason, there is a distaste or a we're better than them or they're better than us kind of conversation when I hear Black people saying, oh, we're not African, because of the media portrayals of what Africans look like, which doesn't even make sense because there's 54 countries. Doesn't even make sense because we have Black people in the Caribbean. Doesn't make sense because we have Black people in Latin America. So we're literally everywhere, and there seems to be one type of perception on both sides of each other. So I think the 23andMe test, I love that idea. I've been seeing nothing but positive things come out of that, and I hope that helps more and more African Americans find some sense of identity and belonging. Because then when you're like, oh, maybe I'm part Malian, maybe I'm part Cameroonian, mostly West African, right, according to the transatlantic slave trade, then you decide, oh, I'm going to look up this culture. I'm going to look up more information. I have a reason to understand and learn more. And then that kind of identity, I think, is a bridge to learning more about the continent. And on the flip side, those of us who migrate here do not get any information about Black America. Like we take a big test.
And why is that?
Because white America doesn't care. White America doesn't even understand that they probably do understand how exploited this culture and community is, but Black America is America, right? All of the achievements, all of, just even the use of certain words or slang or nails and hip hop and music and entertainment and basketball and NFL and all of these things. This is what makes American culture. And they don't want to give y'all credit. And they don't teach any immigrant about Black anything. They really don't. So, it's just kind of
Do
like.
you blame the organizations that's out there that's teaching third world countries about African Americans? Do you think that it's part of that media culture that once someone comes here to the United States, the number one thing they say, don't go to the Black community?
I can't say that for certain, but I do place part of the blame on any intermediate person or any middleman that is helping bring immigrants or migrants to this country who are not preparing them for racial inequality, racism, the types of people that live here, why certain people live in certain places, why does Hyde Park look better than Jackson Park? And, all of these things that kind of information is not taught. But I also don't know I also don't know where that's being taught. So maybe it's just not being taught at all. But when immigrants, when they come here, their first thing is survival. And I think a lot of Black Americans, from conversations I've had on various radio shows and like scholarly debates, is that Black Americans feel like they built this country, which they did. African Americans specifically built this country. And people are coming here and not giving back to the Black African American community. So I just think that there's a level of misunderstanding here, because how can I expect somebody who came from a completely violent country, lost their kids, had a machete, chopped their arm off, like some crazy wild things, and then their first thought is to come here and give back to the African American community? That doesn't make sense. I understand that at some point it has to happen, maybe the generation after them, but that's not anyone's immediate thought process when they come here. Their first thought process, I have to survive. I got to find a way to speak English. I don't speak English. I got to learn the language. I'm accented. I don't know how anything works here. You're going from a third world country to a first world country on top of multiple types of trauma. And every person you meet on the way that's supposed to help you is not helping you. So I wish that was conveyed so people here didn't feel some type of way when immigrants come here, because that's something that I've often heard from Black Americans.
Well,
specifically African Americans.
In discussions I have with some Africans who believe that the Black community does not have any culture.
Mm-hmm.
Some even believe that the Black community branches off the African culture. It is false. The Black culture does have their own culture and embraces African culture as well. Therefore, why do some Africans believe there is no culture in the Black community?
I've heard this a lot too. There's a couple different things. Like, number one, all people and all nations, there's a lot of tribalism, right? There's a lot of disconnected fragments of aspects of the culture, things that people want to do that others don't want to do, et cetera, et cetera. But I feel like because of the particular history in this country and the way the transatlantic slave trade manifested around the world, I think that there are a lot of missing cultural components that African Americans were unable to find out or to keep or to hold on to because of how traumatic and how disgusting the slave trade was, and thereafter, like we're still in some form of like slavery, to be honest. It's just moving and working different ways, and people don't know that.
Why do you feel that?
Because I feel like a lot of African Americans are not on the same page in terms of what is identified as their culture. I do believe there's a culture, but what I say is not what the larger consensus may or may not agree with. And I don't think there is a very large consensus that can say, this is our history, this is where this started, this is where that started. It's really difficult. I mean, it is really difficult. It's difficult to pinpoint, because when we get into that conversation, you start learning that the people that made up this quote unquote Black culture in the US are not all descendants of the slave trade. So that's a whole other sticky conversation that people don't want to have. Like, when we're talking about reparations, well, is that going to go for just African Americans, or is that going to go for all types of Black Americans? When we're looking at famous Black celebrities that are idolized in the African American community, some of them are Puerto Rican. If we're talking about Black hip hop, we're talking about New York, you have a lot of Caribbeans, Black Caribbeans, you have a lot of the African American community that have been here, descendants from the beginning of slavery. And then you also have like Afro Latinos. So when we segment certain big cultural loves, it gets a little sticky, because then you start to see, well, this is not only African American. There's some Puerto Ricans in here. There's some Caribbean people in here. Cicely Tyson is Caribbean, right? Like, there's a lot of people in African American culture that are not strictly Black American, but we haven't dissected that because the US and Black people in general want so much to say Black people did this and Black people did that, which I agree with, because Black people in general have done a lot. But that also causes an issue a little bit in terms of, where does this achievement belong to? Who does this achievement belong to? So do you think African Americans have flushed all of that out in order to say, this is ours?
Well, it's not for me to say. Mm-hmm. There's the however component, and that however component is, we can say to a certain extent something is ours, mm-hmm. even though it's rightfully ours. Mm-hmm. We're not allowed to say it's rightfully ours. You get what I'm saying on 100%. That? Mm-hmm. That brings me to the point that you mentioned, reparations. And reparation is another topic that is also a disconnect between Africans and the Black community. And mm-hmm. my thing is, number one, I think that the African American community needs to have that understanding, what is reparation mm-hmm. as a whole? Because a lot of people, especially in the Black community, think reparation means money. It does not mean money. It means land. It means ownership. So when people say, I'm entitled, in a way, yes. In a way, no. But first, we have to define reparation. What is your thoughts? Because you mentioned reparations. I want you to elaborate on that for a minute.
Roman, do you mind if I push back really quickly before answering this? And
sure, go ahead.
The reason why, maybe pushback is not the right word, but it caused me to think, you said we need to define reparations first, right? As the Black community. And I think language is very, very important in how we are able to categorize people and have a level of understanding of others. And oftentimes, in today's conversation alone, you've been saying Black, Black, Black to identify African American people. So as somebody who works with the global Black,
are you saying me per se, or what?
You and a lot of Black people I know in this country, right, use the word Black to actually denote a very specific ethnic group that are considered African Americans. Whether or not this population agrees on the term African American is another conversation. It has to be had with people of that ethnic group. However, when you say we need to define reparations, I think the first thing we need to define is Blackness. I think the first thing we have to define, as anybody who considers himself quote unquote Black or dark skinned or whatever, we need to understand what Blackness means, because there's a very, very specific lens in which the majority of the world views Blackness and how it's used in this country. And also,
but why do you think it needs to
also in other ways? Maybe that's an impossible task. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just something that I wrestle with, and something that I think a lot of people wrestle with, because if we're talking about unity, if we're talking about diasporic relations, if we're talking about understanding one another, we have to be careful about the words we use to describe people. And I love the word Black, don't get me wrong, but Black to me, Black to everybody that was protesting for George Floyd, or any Black issue that happened in the US, to the point where it's made its way all around the world, is not just African American. Black is a global term. Black is a global umbrella term that we need to kind of, in my opinion, we need to start using correctly. Because what happens
and I'm sorry, but I just want to jump in. I can agree with you there. Mm-hmm. Again, there's a however component to this conversation, because now there are the terminology. When you're saying terms, let's go with a person of color. Mm-hmm. That gets under my skin, because when a person use a person of color, you're talking about, it could be a white woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, not really.
No, because when you use the word minority, you can use a term for a white woman. When you use a person of color, when you use that phrase, it paints a picture. And to me, going through history, seeing the word color, mm-hmm. and people and politicians use a person of color, that's mm-hmm. an escape route, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Escape route to not identify specifically Black or brown issues, or Black or brown specifically of what someone, and they get a pass from the media without saying specifically Black or brown. What do you refer to when you say a person of color? And mm-hmm. and that alludes to what you're talking about. When you're talking about the identification, I know you want to jump in. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm listening to you, and I do agree that politicians use that. Well, most of these politicians are mostly white, number one. So what do they know? But if we're gonna
I have heard Hispanics mm-hmm. use the term, and I've mm-hmm. heard Blacks use the word, which I cringe, and I say, you ought to know better.
Well, go ahead. So no, that's okay. I think this is why I brought up the whole, let's look into some of these words, right? It's really, really important for us to do that. And also how they're used. So there could be a definition that is just not being used properly. There's also connotations that change over time, right? And so when we use the word people of color, I promise you, white people are not calling themselves people of color. So I understand that that's maybe how you're viewing it, but I can go in my neighborhood right now and talk to every white person, and I have never ever heard a white person refer to themselves as a person of color, because the whole point of using the phrase quote unquote person of color is to say that whiteness is devoid of color. That's the whole reason why this phrase is even used. So if we're using this logic that whiteness is devoid of color, that means everybody else has color. That's the whole point of the phrase. And the reason why you hear a lot of people talk about that is because colonialization, imperialism, all of that is happened by white folks. So just because what happened in India may not be the same thing that happened in Nigeria, doesn't mean that the effects are not very similar, if not the same. It just manifests very differently. The entire world was plagued by the same continent. And so I feel like this is a relational thing, like, oh, people of color, like we all were affected by this very terrible global, colonization problem. But yes, there are people who use that phrase to also not get specific. And I agree with you there. In terms of using the word Black or brown, when we hear people talking about brown people, they're talking about every brown person. They're not talking about just Mexico. They're not talking about just Nicaragua or Chile or Brazil. They're talking about Indian Americans too. They're talking about Laos Americans, Filipinos. Sometimes some people even use that to denote Middle Eastern people because they often look brown. So this is just a coloring terminology that I wish we could just throw it all together, but because I don't really agree with calling people based off of a color, because if anybody knows anything about genetics, especially the most diverse place where genetics is found, which is Africa, I have a very, very dark-skinned dad. I have a very, very light-skinned mom or yellow-toned mom. All my siblings all have different shades. So genetics is a very big role. And so what is that going to mean, that if somebody who's real light-skinned
But since
another
since you
country is
brought
not
it,
considered brown? Do you get
but
what I'm
since
saying? Or not considered black? So
but I get what you're saying. But since you brought it up, what ethnicity, if possible, if you want to share with us,
what ethnicity, what?
what ethnicity are you?
I am Ethiopian.
Okay.
So this is another thing that I think people need to break down. There's a difference between nationality, ethnicity, tribal group, right? The tribal group I come from is Amaras. My ethnicity would be Ethiopian. My nationality is American. I don't hold dual citizenship at the moment, but we're working on that. But I think that needs to be, people need to understand the difference of these things. So when I'm talking about Blackness, right, the way that it's used in this country is to denote African Americanness. And so that's why I'm bringing it back to, like, when we say brown and Black people, we're talking about everybody under the sun that's brown. But when we talk about Black people, we're only talking about African Americans. And that's a problem to me. That not that I don't care about my African American brothers and sisters, but it paints a very tiny picture of what Blackness is and the global Black issues that plague all of us, that are connected, in which we would want support from. Like, African Americans need support from other Black people who are dealing with very similar things in other countries, so we can actually be united and confront the same injustice, the same beast, that is just manifesting differently. But we don't have a global understanding of Blackness. It's only used in the context of America. So that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, we need to get better as the global Black community, the African American community, the immigrants back home and wherever else, Black, brown, all these folks. We need to have a better understanding, because if you think about it, even we're doing Black History Month, compared to all the other heritage months, we're not talking about the global Black diaspora. We're talking about African American history, which is important for any immigrant to understand. So it's not to take it away. I understand it and I appreciate it, and we all need to know it. But when we say Black, other people in other parts of the world are like, oh, they don't know whose cultural identity is that. They're just seeing it as, oh, that's just American. No, it's very specifically African American. It's not Ghanaian. It's not Nigerian. It's not Moroccan, right? And so I think.
But here's the pushback, though.
Okay.
When you're in America,
Mm-hmm.
they don't see you as an Ethiopian.
Of course.
They don't see you as, if you're dark skinned and let's say your dad, who's I don't know if he's in America, a dark skin, he's dark skinned, and your mom light skinned, and they don't see that. At the end of the day, a person who is white going to look at you as a Black woman, a Black male, a Black this, a Black that. Yep. And that's America. Yep. So like I said, we can have the conversation, but at the end of the day, we're all Black.
But the problem that comes with that is, if you have people who are Black all over the world, that doesn't mean anything just saying we're just Black. If I can't understand your language, if I don't understand your culture, if I don't understand your shortcomings or what happened to this population here, that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm Black if I'm in Brazil too. I'm Black if I'm in South Africa too. So the way we use Blackness is precisely what I'm trying to convey here, is that we all know we're Black because it's obvious, but coming from an African nation, no one calls himself Black. Why? Because it's redundant. I have people, all my neighbors look like me. But why would we have to call ourselves Black? Do you
Why
get
they
what I'm
call it
saying?
redundant? Yes, you said they
It's
call it redundant. Why they call it redundant?
Oh, no. They don't call it redundant. I'm saying it's redundant for anybody that comes from a nation full of blackness to ever use the word black. It doesn't make sense. Now, when you come to a nation where you are a minority, right? That makes sense. But even then, they can't identify with what it means to be black, because what they can identify with is what it means to be Jamaican, what it means to be Trinidadian, what it means to be Afro-Puerto Rican. So this is precisely the problem. We're expecting people who come from very rich cultures and rich ways of viewing themselves just to come here and call themselves black, which isn't wrong, but it's not accurate, right? Black is a global term. Black is an umbrella term. That's like telling somebody from France, you need to call yourself Italian. Or somebody from India who is warring with Pakistan.
But if you're
you need to call
Italian,
yourself Pakistani.
just like if you're in London, they call you a Black Londonian. If you're
not really, not all the time. Not.
But if you're an Italian, they will call you a Black Italian.
Yes, but if they know where you're from, if somebody happens to know where you're from, they will call you by where you're from. Like, especially if it's obvious. If you have an accent, they know you're not American right away. So no one's ever called any accented person that I know from any culture, from any country that's Black, oh, you're just Black. What they're gonna say is, you are Black, you look Black, but you're not really Black. And I've heard that from African Americans my entire life. I have heard that in the resettlement world and immigration. I've heard that from Africans, because precisely this point, there is a lack of understanding of Blackness. There's a lack of understanding of what is African American. And I think we need to just finally get to this point so we can make sense of things and how we use language and how we use words. And also for African Americans to have ownership, right? If you're looking at funding or looking at the US Census data, it just says Black, right? It's not specific to the plight of the people who built this country. So what would the benefit be there? The benefit would be,
it goes back
we
to
have an
what I
ethnic
said
marker.
before. It goes back to what I said before. At the end of the day, the US government, you're a Black woman, I'm a Black man. Hands down, even though I get what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the census. They don't have they have other. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't identify as other, what you're going to check? So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, it's going to be plain and simple. Yeah, I detect an accent, but if you're walking down the street, you're a Black man. You're a Black woman.
I agree with you.
Until you open your mouth.
Agreed.
So I just want to say this. I'm just going to, I know I promised you an hour, but we got caught up into this. So I'm going to ask for you to stay and extend the conversation, because we always have a good conversation talking about the disconnect between the African American community and the African community. Now, I want to ask this question, and thank you for staying with us. Do you feel the disconnect between the Africans and the African American community has something to do with culturalism? You mentioned that earlier. Do you feel like it has something to do with it?
Can you rephrase that question for me? I don't know if I'm quite understanding.
Oh, what I said is, do you feel the disconnect between Africans and African American community has something to do with culturalism?
Yes and no. Yes and no. It's the first impact of information is what we see on TV back home and what you guys see on TV over here. That's the first point of contact. Film, music, songs, whatever. So yes, culturalism plays a role, but that's for any group. That's not particular to Black people around the world. That's specific to people in general who have a culture and don't want to be mistaken for another culture. Like that's just every culture. I've seen every culture do that. Like if you talk to Rohingya people who, are coming from Myanmar or Burma, they don't want to be mistaken for Pakistani. They don't want to be mistaken for anything else besides who they are. That's what humans do. Now, do some people take offense? Yes. Do some people not? Yeah. Like I don't take offense if somebody called me another ethnic group. Well, why would I be offended? Like there's nothing wrong with people, like from their cultural background or what they do or what they don't do. As long as you're not a bad human being, it's just ignorance or miseducation or just not knowing, not being exposed. But culturalism plays a role, but that's for anybody. That's not specific to Black people. And also, I have another issue with people saying African culture and Black African American culture. African Americans are a tiny, tiny drop of the scope of Blackness. So, or the scope of Black people in the world. So we're comparing a small population in this community to 54 countries, pushing them together like all the white folks do to Black people or to people of color. I know you don't like that phrase. And say that's a whole community, a whole continent is a whole community. Like, yes, there are things that we have in common, but that also takes away from the differences and the cultural history of each nation in the country that people from those countries are proud of. So again, I urge us to be accurate in distinguishing between people for the sake of appreciating culture, but also for the sake of not doing what white people have done to us, to you, to other people of color. So it's not a dig. It's just, I think we really have to start thinking about how we use language. And because that's a really big comparison, 54 countries and this whole community, and people in one country don't even get along. Ethiopia is going through a huge ethnic problem right now with tribalism. So many tribes are trying to break apart, take pieces of history and rewriting it. And we're saying that this one country is an example who has tribal issues, who aren't even getting along on the entire idea of culture sometimes. And then we're saying, well, we're just going to put all these people together who have all these tribal issues in all these countries and call this one large community. I think that's a bit problematic, but I understand when others use it for the sake of unification purposes. But we just have to be careful with language. I think we really need to do a better job with understanding each other, and that starts with language as well.
Okay, we're going to take a brief break, and when we come back, we'll have more with Rebecca Zalilo. Thank you. So go ahead, take a break, and we'll be back. You ready?
Can you say that again?
You ready to come back?
This is an old computer, so sometimes it goes in and out. I'm gonna need you to say it one more time. I'm so sorry.
Okay. You ready to
Yes.
come back?
Yes, sir. Hey, Roman.
Yes.
Really quickly, can I ask you a question before you get back on?
Well, you're still live.
Oh, okay. I will message you then. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Just let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, and we are back on the Drive at 5 on intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station. We are with introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Zalalo. I am a refugee and immigration rights advocate, as well as community organizer here in Chicago.
And the topic we are discussing today is the disconnect between Africans and the African American community. Now, let me ask you this question. In your opinion, do you think both Africans and the African American community have an identity crisis defining their isms, while other communities and ethnic groups define theirs already?
Can you please go into these particular isms that you're talking about or that you have in your mind?
Oh, sure. So this, again, this is my opinion. Now, the African American community isms is separatism and individualism, while African isms is separatism, individualism, and collaboratism. Do you think I am wrong for that assessment, while the Black community is missing that one component, and that is collaborism? It's kind of like identifying your isms, and it just seems like our isms is not what it is. Are we suffering from those identity crises?
I don't know if I have a strong answer right now, because I think I have to do a bit more thinking on this. But as far as the 2 to 3 different isms that you're talking about, I am interested, before I share my answer, to hear your definitions of these terms, just so I know how to use it in the context of my explanation. Individualism is pretty common, so it's fine. Collaboratism, I think you're using it in the sense of people are not wanting to collaborate with others. And then separatism could go anyway. So do you mind explaining how you define those?
Separatism is basically you're doing your own thing, I'm doing my own thing, and it can also be in comparison to individualism. But the separatism is basically like we are totally separate, no commonality in what we're doing, and it comes back to we're doing the same thing, but I can give you a brief scenario. It's kind of like, okay, instead of having, let's say, a big storefront with a whole bunch of barbers, this barber wants to go over here, this barber wants to go over there, that barber wants to go over here, instead of collaboratism. So what I'm saying is we have individualism and separatism, but no type of collaborism going on. And the definition of isms is basically which side are you on? And it just basically, are we suffering from an ism crisis that separates the Africans and the African American community?
Okay. Thanks for clarifying your definitions. I thought that separatism and individualism, in the way you described it, were all basically the same, because individualism would also subscribe to the same way that you describe separatism, right? Which is, okay, we're over here, we have no commonality, we're doing our own thing, we're not doing it for the greater collective good, right? That's exactly what individualism is. It's not a collectivist mindset or identity, and it's a very first world, very American identity. So I want to start there. I don't really think that Africans have an individualism mindset. It's doesn't really exist because we're a collectivist unit. We are literally like everybody in your village has a role to contribute to the greater population, to the greater good. And you see this in countries where people look like each other. So of course, when you are in a country where everybody does not look like each other, people are going to pull back and shrink into the groups and into the people that they know that look like them or that have the same culture, the same language as them. And if you're calling that separatism, in terms of like, you might see a whole bunch of different Black people around the world, not necessarily quote unquote supporting each other. And that people could take that a whole bunch of different ways. Let me use an example in terms of business. I could see why you might say, okay, this could look like separatism within the overall Black diaspora, because Nigerians might want to be with Nigerians over there. Cameroonians might want to work with Cameroonians over there. You know, Trinidadians might want to be over here. Eritreans might want to be over there. Moroccans might want to be over there. That makes sense. Everybody shrinks to the not shrinks. Everybody pulls back to their native homeland, language, culture, whatever. African Americans do it too. I'm not seeing a whole bunch of African Americans going to different Black, African cultural groups or Caribbean cultural groups if they don't come from those cultural groups. So this is not to say that I'm not looking at this as separatism. I'm not looking at that as individualism. I'm looking at that as it's a very human thing to want to be near your culture, how you grew up, the foods you ate, the language you speak. That's a very human thing to do. So I wouldn't see that as separatism. The individualism aspect, I think, is very first world versus third world. Even if you're looking at a village in Nicaragua or Chile or Brazil, whatever, there's a sense of we have a role here. We are supporting one another. I take care of all your kids when you go to work. Sometimes like it's a collectivist. Third world is very collectivist. First world isn't. You look at Europe, you look at UK, for example, other countries that are considered first world don't operate that way. Very individualistic. There are pros and cons to both. But if we're just being real, to me, it's more so of the region you live in and what that region means to the world and what that region contributes or gains from others. So that's where the individualism and collectivism, I would label them as. Collaboratism can also be related to separatism in your definition, because it's like, well, we're not working together, so then we're gonna close off and do our own thing. So, they're all very related. I don't really see them as being as separate as you might see them.
Let me stop you there, if I may. So here's what I mean by that. Okay, the African American community. Let's start with the Haitian issue, because that's fairly recent. And the African American community was livid. Some went down there, brought water and clothing and food and stuff like that. there's the however component. When an issue, and I'm saying some, and I'm going by some Africans believe that that's their fight. That Trayvon Martin issue is their fight. It's not our fight. Some Africans say that's wrong to think that way. That's where the separatism goes in at. That's why I'm saying the disconnect is that some people think that this is not their fight, but every time African Americans say, yes, this is our fight. Your response to that?
Like I mentioned earlier, it's silly for anyone to expect anyone with multiple traumas, whether they're African American, whether they're immigrants, refugees, asylees, SFVs, etc., to be able to take on a fight outside of their own. And I'm talking about immediate survival. So we just have to, I think people have to get on board with this concept. Like there's a very quote unquote European way of, I don't know if it's a way of thinking, but it's what we're taught in psychology and in college and in different classes, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Home, food, those kind of things are basic survival needs for any human being. If you are not receiving those, I do not think it is in your best interest or in anybody's best interest to start advocating on the behalf of somebody else. That's just like getting on an airplane and trying to protect somebody else and not put on your mask first. So
let me get this straight. Hold on, let me get this straight. So you're saying, okay, if, and again, fairly recent, you're saying that the Haitian community should have rallied up together, went down to the border, and the African American community should have said, that's not our fight.
No.
Is that what you're saying? No, you're not saying that.
No.
Okay,
I'm not
I just
want
to, I'm basically want to hear you correctly. That's what I'm
sure. Thank you for clarifying. I'm not saying that, but I am saying if there are specific African Americans who are not receiving, who do not have a home, who do not have food, who are literally struggling to survive, then I would say it's in your best interest to take care of your immediate survival needs first. And that goes for any human being. Now, from the outside looking in, everybody's looking at African Americans like, y'all been here, y'all should have it together by now. And I'm just relaying what a lot of people believe. Me living here and working in the African American communities, as well as other Black communities, I understand why things are the way they are. I understand the history. And I'm hoping that people are able to teach those histories to others, but I don't know if it's right to teach that to somebody who's immediately experiencing a whole bunch of trauma and saying that's the answer. So I don't think that's the answer. I do think that those of us who are the children of immigrants are often the ones who are going to be the bridge to have this conversation be understood, because we're experiencing both simultaneously, right? We're experiencing both at the same time. Our whole lives it's a tug of war that no one understands unless they're in this position. So African Americans helping, if they were able to help, that's wonderful. And look, I think African Americans are responding this way because of the images and how they directly reminded everybody of images you see in the history book that went down in slavery. I think that has a big role, a big factor to why Black people responded the way they responded. I also think Black people, the global Black world, is looking at it and saying, it doesn't matter if they're from Haiti. It doesn't matter if they're from African American. It doesn't matter if they're from the UK. We are all Black. What happens to this Black person can happen to you or me at any moment. So we have to also get out of this mentality that this is an other's problem. However, we have to be realistic with those who are able to help and those who are not. Haitian Americans who live in this country for 100% should have been able to rally together and try to make some changes, which they did. There are different Haitian American groups in the US. There's one in Chicago in particular, and they're doing that. So I think their response is exactly what they needed to do. And I'm very thankful that African Americans who were able to assist did what was the right human thing to do. So there's no judgment on any of that.
I know because of timing's sake, and I still want to thank you for extending your stay here, because this conversation is deeply needed. This is one thing that I want to share, is basically Africans don't understand that the African American community is pigeonholed through legislation. And when people say that African American community looks for a handout, you also have to understand that they were pigeonholed through legislation, like the voting rights. And look at what's happening. We're doing our best. We're rallying. We're doing this and we're doing that. But I'm seeing some Africans, and I'm going by what I see. I'm not saying your opinion or anybody else. What I see is Africans folding up their arms, and it's not a united front, because the way I see it, if it affects us, it's going to affect you. Like you said earlier, just a couple of minutes ago, some Africans don't look at it that way, and don't look at that the African American community is pigeonholed. What's going to affect us eventually is going to affect you. I don't get that concept. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's just because they don't know. It's just because they don't know. And again, like, this first world versus third world component is a very big component. It's a very big influential factor for how people view each other. Everybody in the world, and I'm not just talking about the global Black diaspora, I'm talking about every single nation outside the US, looking at the US like, dang, they got money. Wow, they must have golden streets here. Man, these people that live in this nation should be way better off than everybody else in the world. When my mom got here as through the asylum process, she literally thought the streets were golden here. Like, for real, really thought that. And when she got here, just like most immigrants, they're disappointed. They're like, dang, America's not what we thought. What is the American dream? It's not really real. And I could go on and on about studies I've done, conversations I've had, people all over the world disappointed in the America that they are in. So it has to do with the perception of America and the perception of everybody else that's not America. But that's really what it comes down to.
But they don't look at the legislation process, and it goes back to historical times as, hey, if you really look at it, we recently had voting rights, if you look at it. Even though it's like decades and decades ago in the 1960s and late 60s, you got to look at women's rights. Same thing.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why some Africans, and I'm not saying all, I'm saying some, don't understand the legislative process and why it stymied and pigeonholed the African American community.
Listen, I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. But if I can say, I don't think people think that the U.S. government is like as bad as as it is. This is, again, all comes down to the perception of the U.S. and the kind of life that people think they're going to live here. All of that is related. All of that is together. Nobody's thinking the US government's going to hurt me, is going to harm me. I'm safe here. I came here. My children are going to go to school. The people that are coming into this country, we have to also remember, like, the statuses that I told you earlier, refugee and asylee. These are people who don't have documentation with them, that are fleeing, like literally in process of fleeing. The things you saw that Haitians were going through, those are the types of people that are coming here. They don't even have their education documents. They don't even have like anything, birth certificates, nothing. All of that has to be restarted here. They think the government is here to help them. And all of this is a very, very specific tactic to not allow Black people to be have a united front. It is what it is. So
in your assessment, you're saying that, the government as well as the media has portrayed the Black community, the African-American community as the boogeyman. It's unsafe. It's violent. Don't move there. Don't do this, don't do that. And that's where the separatism comes in at. And that's why it's like, it's okay to set up a braiding shop here. I want your money, but as far as the culturalism and the ism part, I'm going to do away with it.
I think so. I think that's accurate. For those who may say, well, it's not good to judge people, right? I agree, but this is not just any kind of, this is not like some leisurely judgment where I'm at a school and safe and have a home over my head. This is people's initial contact by people who are saving them, quote unquote saving them. It's not real saving, but it's saving them. They are going to listen to the people saving them. That's just the reality. So I think if African Americans understood how the immigration process worked here, everything will make sense. Like, I mean, not everything, but a lot of things will make sense. Why are people scared of African Americans? I mean, that would be answered right there. Why are certain populations of people able to come to the US and not other populations of people? What are the benefits of those populations coming to the country and not others? All of these things are related. And that's just the reality of it. That's just the reality. So I don't think it's purposeful separatism in the sense of we don't want to be, I don't know, maybe it is purposeful, maybe it's not, but it's all tied to survival and safety. It really is. And that's the worst way to make someone scared of somebody else.
Let's end on a positive note. And I know
this was deep. This was rough and deep, but we had to go there.
So what will be an olive branch for the Africans? Because I think the African American community, and I'm going by what I see, embrace the African culture, what we talked about earlier. What will be the olive branch for Africans to say, I get it, I understand now? What Blacks need to do to say, okay, let's sit down. Let's go to 63rd and College. Let's go to the Austin community in Inglewood. We're not all bad, what the media portrays.
I know. People have to push past their fear, but if you've been taught that for the 20 years you've been here, right? Or, you, when I say you, I mean a particular immigrant or refugee, asylee, whatever. I don't think they're going to be the first ones to make that dive of going to a place that they were told is dangerous, where they are gonna get injured or hurt, if that's the exact background that they left. You get what I'm saying? So what I am very proud of are those who are in my situation that are living both truths, right? I'm a Black American. None of the police is looking at me like, oh, Ethiopian radar, we got to treat her differently. No one's doing that. I look just like every other Black person to them, and I understand that. But some of the people before me don't. They don't understand that concept. Because they're like, well, we know about people all over the world. How come Americans don't understand the differences of people? They don't understand the context of Blackness in this country, or in the UK versus Brazil versus whatever. So there's a different context in each country that, because of George Floyd, has brought very critical conversations in a lot of African households, and also fear. Like, I know plenty of people who are telling me not to go to protests, not to go to this and that, but that's in my blood, number one. And, my dad was a political activist back home and prisoner of war, all of that stuff. So that's just in my particular blood. But for other people, it's a matter of life and death. Like, do I want my children to go to a protest because I came through a boat, quote unquote, illegally, which is a terrible term to use for human beings, to get here, and now you're about to put yourself in some danger? So I think we just need to, there has to be some sort of better understanding, but it's going to really happen from those who are experiencing both cultures, so to speak, or both forms of Blackness. And I do think that the Gen Z, some of the millennials, are really breaking that mold and having these deep conversations. If you look at Red Table Talk, they have 3 generations of Black women that are having conversations, and it starts at home, but you see a lot of it happening from Gen Z and the millennials. So I think there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of people trying to do this work. And a lot of African people, you will be surprised, who are in this country, who grew up here, who identify as Black. You just don't see that, but there are a lot. And the ones who are in their 20s and younger, who grew up here or who lived here for enough time and who understand what's going on in the political atmosphere of this country, they have no problem calling themselves Black. That's not an issue, and there's no problem with solidarity. So I think that's where the hope is going to come in. And those of us who are having these conversations and, making sure that we bring it home too, because it's different generations of people who have different upbringings and understandings of the way the world works and how it worked for them. So that's my 2 cents.
and we appreciate your 2 cents as well. Please tell intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio station where they can get a hold of you, and as well as some resources, just in case somebody is watching and needs some resources to have this conversation, or to reach out to a community organization or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So I would say, if you're looking to have more information about immigration and Black immigration particularly, and how, anti-Blackness, the role of every problem that Black people have ever faced, I would look to BAJI. They are the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. You can type that in Google. I can't remember the exact URL. It's probably .org. That's the best resource on anything Black and anything immigration related. So please go there. If you want to have an understanding on like the global perspective on humanitarian crises and aid, please go to www.rescue.org. Please go check out IRC, United Nations websites. I mean, those are the most international kind of websites. And then also, if you're looking to get, connected to organizations in Chicago that are working on immigration and refugee, whatever, and if you have a desire to really focus on the Black perspective and the Black focus, Refugee Action Network is an organization that is now really taking a plunge in Black immigration issues, even though it's not an overall Black organization. So please check them out. It's called Refugee Action Network for the state of Illinois. World Refugee Day Chicago, if you're interested in celebrating immigrants of all shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds. And, you know, if you would like to contact me, I'm sure Roman can share my information on the flyer as well if you would like some more information on any of these topics. But thank you for having me, and please do some research for yourself so we can finally, you know, come to a more united front.
All right. Well, thank you. And I'm going to ask you to text me that information so I can put it on there as well. So don't be a stranger to the Drive at 5. It's always good to have this conversation with you. And during Black History Month, it's always a pleasure to have this conversation. And again, this conversation always brings some type of solution. So we got to continue to have it, and you're more than welcome to come back on the drive. Okay. Have a good one.
Thank you
okay?
so much. You too.
All right. That's going to do it for us on the Drive at 5 on intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station. Thanks to Earl Winfrey back in the studio, Wanda, who's behind the scenes. And I wanted to let you guys know briefly, this will be not my last show. I will be back, but I will be going on a hiatus, and I will explain that to you on Sunday. And I will be leaving you with good hands. Rhea Ray will be subbing for me for 4 weeks, and I will be back with you. So I will explain all of that on Sunday to let you know what's going on and so forth and so on. So stay tuned for that, and you guys have a wonderful week. Have a good one.